Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. This will be the second episode about the series of the Wretched of the Years. In the first one I put some ideas developed by Frantz Fanon, speak about other of his books such as Dying Colonialism, Black Skin, White Mask, also the context in which he was writing during the Algerian War of Independence and the global framework of that years with the Cold War and the decolonization process in other areas such as Indochina, Morocco, India, Cuba, and so on. So I wanted to start here for one of the first criticism that Frantz Fanon does against those he considered the elites of the colonies. For instance, he refers to the intellectual who fights in order that the settler and the native may live together in peace. This is a clear reference to Albert Camus. Albert Camus was a Pied Noir from Spanish and French origin that was born in Algeria. He later on won the Nobel Prize of Literature. He wrote incredible books such as The Fall, The Plague, which is my favorite of him, and also the other is the Stranger, in which he depicts perfectly racism against the Algerian population. So Camus was in favor of a kind of peace settlement agreement between Algerians and French people. However, Fanon believed that once the colonial context disappeared, the settler won't have any interest in coexisting, and there is no point in trying to establish peace between them because it has been impossible to do in previous decades. He also criticized Camus in other of his books in Dying Colonialism. Those are different points of view of probably the two most important political writers, intellectuals that were in that year in Algeria, although Camus, I think, was living in France at the time, but he traveled sometimes to Algeria, and there is one episode in which he gave a conference, I think it was in Algiers, in order to portray his ideal of peace between the French, Algerian, and the native population. In fact, he is not the only figure that Frantz Fanon criticized, because also he criticized he attacks fiercely the president of Senegal, Senghor, and he says, quote, "We have demanded that the higher parts should be given to Africans after the decolonization. And now Senghor is Africanizing the Europeans." As the president of Senegal, Senghor was, according to Fanon, trying to give those better positions in the new country to the Europeans, as they accordingly had more knowledge about the kind of capitalist structure implemented from Europe. And for Fanon, this was a perversion of the colonization. The idea was to create an egalitarian society with the inception of the new human rather than to imitate the ideals extrapolated by Europe. In that sense, Frantz Fanon explains that some intellectuals direct the decolonization to their own benefits, to open the market, gamble on the stock exchange, implement unfair promotion, corruption, and so on. But for him, if we want to accomplish an efficient decolonization, it is necessary that the area has been shaken by the struggle from liberation. Because the problem for Fanon is that the settler manipulate the truth and assure that if they were expelled, the country will become unable to survive. The settler makes the history in that sense. So when they leave the country, they destroy the structures, they take out all the money, and they leave the country poorer than it was before, and then on they say, oh, look, we did not have to leave the country because they don't know how to govern themselves, and so on. For that reason, the emergence of elites is something which Fanon disputes openly. He criticized them because they offer nationalist discourses to join the masses, employ the rhetoric of freedom, equality, but demand more power to the colonizer, and at the same time stop colonizer revolution. As in Latin America happened when they wanted to use the mass of the population to join against the USA while cutting the black empowerment that happened during the movement of independence in the 19th century and the 20th century and so on. First against Spain, then against the USA, how this idea happened also in Algeria and other African countries, as Fanon explained, to want to use the bulwark of the mass of population, the muscle that they provide in order to take away the elites, but at the same time do not want to give equal power to everybody. And in that kind of chain, there is a group of figures which benefit from that. For that reason, Fanon distinguishes between the bourgeoisie, which are the colonizers, the elites, which are the colonized people, but the ones that are on top, and the majority of people. And he laments how the bourgeoisie and the elites, they ally together. When the bourgeoisie see that their privilege are in peril and the independence is imminent, they establish an agreement with the elites in order to stay in the country, at least symbolically or economically doing trades with them, whereas the majority of people are getting neglected. Fanon also points how those elites are, quote, violent in their words and reformist in their attitudes, end quote. The native intellectuals demand improvement to their sector, increased salaries, liberty of the press, but at the same time do not want to redistribute this wealth and the new rights among everybody. And in fact, among this alliance between the bourgeoisie and the elites, Fanon explains that colonialism only loses its hold when the knife is at its throat. Henceforth, just when the colonizers see that there is no point on going back to how the things were before the struggle of independence, but at that time, the elites and the colonialist bourgeoisie want to come to terms, and in the end, the majority of people are those who get less benefits from this struggle, even though they have been the main leaders of the revolution. In that sense, Frantz Fanon speaks about the idea of neocolonialism, how the process of colonization has changed, and he explains that in its early days, colonies were a source of raw materials, but now the colonies are a market, a colonizers and colonized interchange product. And he wrote that in 1961, so imagine what would have happened if he had lived like for more years later, when the idea of neocolonialism was more implemented. And now I will go to the ideas expressed by Mireille Fanon, which is her daughter, an interview that she conceived, I think it was 2017, so quite recent. Yeah, because she speaks about Macron as president of the French Republic. So yeah, shortly it was after 2017. So Fanon concludes that, quote, a blind domination founded on slavery is not economically speaking worthwhile for the bourgeoisie of the mother country, end quote. Henceforth, they have to implement a new idea to subject the countries, and this is through capitalism, to the market exchange, to exporting products to these countries, putting their prices and so on. The wars of repression, as he emphasized, are less bloodthirsty than before, more elegant. The liquidation of the, for example, he gives the example that the liquidation of the Castro regime will be quite peaceful. It's interesting that he points that because he wrote in 1961, obviously he was openly aware about what was happening around the world, and the economic blockade has been diminished the chances of Cuba for progress as a society. They wanted to be independent from everything, create their own idea to socialism, creating an egalitarian society in which everybody could work for the benefit of all. I will speak about the Cuban Revolution in other episodes, but the thing is that the US blockade made that impossible, and Frantz Fanon perfectly saw that. there was a common consensus over the world that the idea of violence to oppress people could not be done that openly. Probably this is especially after the Battle of Algiers in 1956-1957, in which the world opinion changed drastically about the events that were happening in Algeria. And there are political theories that have written about that, and some testimonies of French politicians, which they mention how they have won military the Battle of Algiers that was fought in the capital of Algeria from May 1956 until the end of the year, beginning of the next year. But because the whole world saw the torture methods implemented by the French army, the French lost legitimacy in those months of sheer violence. Henceforth, going now to Mireille Fanon and see her idea of neocolonialism, she points how the importance is looking for total emancipation, and how the African continent in 2017, when she conducted that interview, was still under a new form of colonization. And she gives some examples like the European Bank, the functionaries in Africa are paid by money from Europe to obviously benefit the European interest and not the African interest. She spoke about the COP21 that happened in 2015, how many people were arrested without any proof, and this creates an atmosphere of fear among the societies in which people are afraid of lose their work and they live with anxiety, and henceforth they tend to revolt less than before. There is no need to use the violence as much as 60 years ago, although the police violence is still common in our world, unfortunately, even though in those so-called liberal democracies like France, the United States, the United Kingdom, and so on. But still, it is more dreary, the fear created to be neglected from the system. Henceforth, Mireille Fanon criticized globalization because it is a mechanism which doesn't let you choose anything. You must integrate to it. It functions exactly like colonization, conclude Mireille Fanon. For that, she points some ideas to avoid this reality. For example, she says that, quote, "We need to defeat racial racism and structural racism," end quote. Henceforth, we need to build an international movement of cooperation. Because, according to her, quote, "populism emerged in a society where does not value human emancipation," end quote. It's an illusion, a cynic society. So populism, which could be used as a current to unite different people, such as the struggle for liberation, in a society which seems less unselfish than before, it can have some contradictions, and you have the paradox that a populist movement can put people on the leader of the countries like Bolsonaro or Donald Trump. However, there is still hope, I believe, because there are movements that are being global, worldwide covered. There is international solidarity. Speaking about feminism, the ecological movement against climate change, and also like fighting for liberating political prisoners, journalists, and also to redistribute the wealth among the countries of the world. That was seen, for example, during COVID-19, how people ally themselves to force Europeans and the Americans to give more vaccines to the countries, the poorer countries like in Africa and in Asia. So, which conclusion which can extrapolate from Frantz Fanon and his work? There are some ideas worth to remark about what he wrote during his time. For example, he says that it was important to leave Europe, where they are never done talking of man, yet murder men everywhere they find them. It was a rhetoric and its influence to hide their real ideologies. So for that reason, he emphasized the idea of establishing a new humanism And for that reason, emancipation and the common liberation is fundamental. He points, quote, "We can do everything so long as we do not imitate Europe," end quote. He criticized the cynicism of progress and illustrates his point mentioning the atomic bomb. Like he says, okay, the United States is in theory the most advanced country in the world, and they were able to throw atomic bombs in Japan, killing hundreds of thousands of people, contaminating the island, and ruining the life of many more. He warns against the tempting model of Europe to create a new society. He uses the example of the USA as an imitation of Europe, which has become even more monstrous, and at that time it was clearly segregated, giving the most rights to the white people against the black people. That is something that is happening today, even though the social movement of the 1960s today is done in a more subtle way, such as that the prisons are populated by a higher percentage of black population. The black population live in the poorer areas of every city with more contamination and so on. In those years, racism was more openly advocated. You see images in 1950s, 1960s of white people killing, murdering, beating, spitting against the black people. So, for that reason, Fanon believed that a new system must be implemented. Fanon was a Marxist who was not so sure about the economic determinism of Marx, but also he added to that theory the importance of giving more relevance to the difference between cultures, black and white, more power to women, and so on, because he believed that, as I mentioned earlier, that he says that in the colonies, for instance, you are rich because you are white, so the idea of the color of your skin goes interlinked with your economic means, and this materialist conception obviously will have consequence for the rest of the life of everybody, for the individuals and the society. And Marcuse, the German philosopher of the Frankfurt School, he pointed in the 1960s how the working class was not the leader anymore of the change to the transition to socialism, but had to be done by those outsiders, the outcasts of societies, which according to him were the women, the black people, the ethnic minorities, and so on. So those people who were much more oppressed under the system. Obviously, during Marx's time, it made sense to give more emphasis to the working class because they were the bulwark, joining in trade unions, especially in the industrialized countries like Prussia or Great Britain. But at that time, 1 century later, Marx wrote his main books, Fanon, Marcuse, Angela Davis, and many other political theories, Hannah Arendt. They gave more emphasis to this other group, which, according to them, will have those ones to need to carry the progress. So, Frantz Fanon do not idealize the idea of the life before the colonies, because he says, quote, "There is no question of a return to nature. It is simply a very concrete question of not dragging men toward mutilation." So he doesn't, end quote, he doesn't say that, okay, everything that has happened here is completely evil, we need to get rid of everything, but just say, okay, with all the knowledge that we have acquired and the inspiration that we can take from worldwide movement, we just need to not imitate what has Europe done. Doesn't seem that we need to start in a tabula rasa completely, but getting some influences, like some ideas, as he pointed of Marxism, some of the Enlightenment, more important ideology like the liberty, the freedom, the equality, and with all of this we can help to create a new society. In that sense, what I wanted to say more about here, okay, well, he points to some of the meetings in the United Nations General Assembly in 1960, in which the colonial representative so violent language, with the third world spokesmen were reserved a teenage role. So this is also important because it is not just in the colonies the settlers were using violence means against the population, but also during this kind of institutional meetings, like in the United Nations, which was arguably the most important international institution in the world, how the colonial representative, like from the main countries, they had even more time, more power to speak against the third world spokesman. And obviously this have also consequences in the creating of laws and so on. So the idea of colonialism was not just inherent in the territories, but also within the institutional sphere. And obviously this will be very, very difficult to change along the years. As I mentioned before, 1950s, 1960s, you have the new advances about the struggles against imperialism. He points about the Hungarian Revolution and the Suez Canal. Hungarian Revolution, the movement in Hungary against the Soviet Union, and the Suez Canal in Egypt against Great Britain and France. So in that sense, Frantz Fanon does not ally either with the Soviet Union or with the United States, France and Britain, Western or East. He points that the new society must be socialist, must be egalitarian, but does not have do not need to have leaders on top which will benefit about everything, but rather a kind of common society in which everything will be shared by everybody. For that reason, he points how imperialism fears most the intromission of socialist ideas than proper violence, because socialism can get into the minds of people and will convince them to establish a society based on mutual aid, international solidarity, and those, according to Fanon, are the main fears of imperialism. And precisely for that, Cuba was hugely attacked by the Western powers, especially the United States, because it was an example that another kind of society, it was possible. So, just to finish this episode, I wanted to explain the influence of Frantz Fanon in the 1960s. Like his book, The Wretched was, as Husband pointed, a Bible for the movement in those years. Even though that book was not very influential in the Algerian War of Independence, because it just finished 1 year later. But for the rest of the decade, which saw the uprising in 1968 in Mexico, in France, 1967 in US Germany, 1968 also in the United Kingdom, and so on. Those ideas of violence for emancipating themselves, the idea of creating a new kind of society, were inherent in those years. And I will finish here the episode, and the last one I will talk about a bit this idea of how violence was established as the main ideology to create the states in the world, and how the need for get the world upside down, eliminate that violence, systematic violence, and establish a new beginning for the countries based on the colonial context was fundamental for Frantz Fanon.